The BBC has zero method for actually monitoring what they do. We monitored what they do.
The model is blind. The model doesn't know that this comes from the BBC and this doesn't. And we're doing things over and over and over again in big numbers.
You've developed a method that newsrooms could use themselves in order to establish not if one specific article or broadcast is problematic, but to look at your broad overall output and say, we have potentially a problem.
We now have a method that allows us to give, again, numbers and to look on the things the way they are without being affected with our prejudice, with our beliefs, or with anyone else.
We showed that over a period of 4 months, which is 9 million words, they were not balanced and they were consistently not balanced. Balance should be consistent across their products.
We thrive on pushback. That's how we, how science works, and this is what we expect in order to refine our methods and get to the bottom of things.
The BBC has what it, I think, laughably calls complaints department, because I say laughably because almost no complaints are ever accepted.
I'm Jonathan Sacerdoti. Dr. Haran Shani-Narkiss, Trevor Asserson, Dr. Oren Tsur, thank you for joining me. Trevor, could you tell me, as the report bears your name, what is the Asserson report?
Well, the Asserson report is a deep dive into the material that was produced and broadcast and published by the BBC during the first 4 months of the present war between Israel and Hamas. And it was intended to try to analyse the material to see whether or not the BBC was compliant with its fundamental obligation, which is an obligation to be impartial in its news reporting. There were many people that were concerned that it was failing to achieve its obligations, to meet its obligations, and we designed experiments to try to see whether or not one could test empirically whether that was the case. What's unusual about the report is that it included 2 completely separate disciplines. That is to say, I'm a lawyer and I use traditional legal principles to run many of the experiments in the report. But I was also joined by a team of very experienced and very senior data scientists who brought a completely new methodology to the analysis of broadcast material. And that's what makes the report particularly, I think, unusual and groundbreaking.
So it's a combination of lawyers and data scientists, and that's where you two gentlemen come in. So the idea then, if I understand you correctly, is to use science and perhaps existing research methods for linguistic and natural language processing to see if there's a way to remove the opinions or biases of the researchers and try and find a sort of objective way of measuring bias in news coverage using computers and learning models. So Oren, you're a senior researcher in computational linguistics and natural language processing at Ben-Gurion University in Israel. Could you tell me how you think that turned out to be the way that you chose using AI to do this?
So the use of machine learning, artificial intelligence, AI in order to analyze text in general and media specifically, and to unpack media bias, or in the literature it's called the media slant, is something we, or the research community, is doing for 20 years or something like that. In that sense, it's not news that machines are used to analyze text and find nuance. Obviously, there are some challenges. What's special, I think, about this effort, the dawn of large language models, ChatGPT, etc., which allow you to work in a sophisticated and, on one hand, and a more straightforward way on the other hand, with very strong models that are capable of analyzing text.
So, Haran, what did you do? What sort of research was it? What were you asking the AI, ChatGPT, and what did you find?
One of the biggest opportunities we had in this point in time is the new era of having large language models like ChatGPT. You can speak with them in human language. It's not about a code or technical terms like weights and layers and the architecture of models that people like Oren and myself are used to deal with when we train models and establish them. but it's more about the language with which you communicate. And this was very helpful for us to speak with the lawyers and to understand which kind of questions we should really ask. So just to give you an example, in classical sentiment analysis model, you would see whether the sentiment is negative or positive, and that's it. Now, if you think about this case, when you speak about Palestinians who are being violent, Hamas, etc., the sentiment would be very negative. But it's also the case when you speak about Palestinians who are suffering from the war and are under, bombings of Israel. So the sentiment would be negative there as well. When it comes to a new large language model like ChatGPT, you can explicitly ask whether someone is depicted as a victim or an aggressor, or you can be way more specific than that, and you can direct the models.
So Trevor, what were the legal aspects? What was the legal framework that was used to assess the BBC's coverage then?
Well, the starting point was the 130 pages or so of guidelines in the BBC. And those guidelines are designed by the BBC to achieve impartial news coverage. Now, not every line of those guidelines relates to news, but much of it does. And what we did is we isolated the principal rules that the BBC sets and then devised experiments to check whether or not those rules were being obeyed. So, for example, the BBC says that where it's reporting from a place of reporting restrictions, it must say so. Because obviously, what they're really saying by telling the audience that there are reporting restrictions is it's quite likely that what's being said isn't true. It's being controlled by a dictatorship. And that's very much the case with almost every word that comes out of Gaza, in which the BBC reminds its audience frequently that they are not allowed into Gaza by the Israeli government. No journalists are allowed into Gaza. Obviously, it's a very dangerous place, and then whatever the reasons might be, but there are many, many journalists working in Gaza that are putting out material. The BBC is giving the audience that material and ought to be giving the health warning. We counted the extent to which it was giving that health warning and almost never gave it. As far as we can see, they never gave that health warning. That's an example, and there were many, many of those rules that we looked at, and each one of those rules we devised ways of testing them empirically.
So just to be clear about that point, it is difficult for journalists to get in. Some journalists have been allowed in on embeds with the IDF, but again, the BBC and others are always keen to point out that they can't get journalists in, but you're saying they don't then make the sort of counterpoint, which is that everything you're therefore seeing comes from people who are already in Gaza, who kind of work from Gaza and maybe either intentionally or unintentionally subject to Hamas propaganda techniques that stop them being able to report fairly.
That's correct. And there's a further, again, one of the obligations that they have is where the person that they're interviewing or that is broadcasting has an interest in the outcome, then they've got to inform you of that. And we decided to look into the background of many of the journalists and many of the talking heads and experts they put in the studio. Many of them were Hamas supporters or Hamas members, and that was concealed from the audience. And we saw very recently in the documentary that had to be withdrawn that a member of a very senior Hamas family was being paid as an actor to act a part which was entirely dishonest, and that was not noticed. If the BBC say they didn't know, that's a bit implausible. But they certainly didn't tell us, and they should have done. That's an example of the rules that they were breaking all the way through.
So those are some of the traditional ways and legal ways that we were looking at, or you were looking at, what the BBC did in terms of its coverage. And as you say, that documentary not only used that Hamas connected child whose father was a Hamas minister, but even engaged in mistranslations, things like translating Yahud as Israeli and jihad as battle, but not really explaining the full context. So there's that example where they had an English subtitle of fighting and resisting Israeli forces, but the accurate Arabic translation is jihad against the Jews. Looking back to the AI side, because I think that this is one of the lesser known parts in the public of what's in the Asserson report, and how it fit in with those legal requirements. Oren, can you tell me a bit about some of the findings that you had, some of the interesting results.
What we actually did was to use ChatGPT to feed it news stories or headlines or both, and to ask two simple questions. Does this headline or story or text convey sympathy toward Israel or toward Gaza, toward Israel or toward Hamas? Okay? And the answers could be either yes and yes, sympathy for both sides, or yes and no, sympathy to only one of the sides, or no sympathy, no specific sympathy for any of the sides. First of all, we saw that if we look at the sympathy ratio, okay, so the sympathy toward the Palestinian side is 1.5 higher than the sympathy towards the Israeli side. This is not biased necessarily.
That in itself isn't the finding that shows a bias, it's simply a way of measuring it.
Exactly, and let me just make sure it's absolutely clear. So the single trial of this experiment is inputting one article by the BBC to a model, ChatGPT-4 in this case, and we kept it simple because it was important for us to be very communicative with the legal team and not to use ensemble of models or anything like that. So you take one article, you input it to ChatGPT-4, and you ask exactly the questions Oren described. Does the following text create sympathy to Israel? Does the following text create sympathy to Gaza? Now, for every such a trial, you can have 4 different outcomes. You can either create sympathy to Israel, but not to Gaza. You can create sympathy to Gaza, but not to Israel. You can create sympathy to both, and it creates sympathy to neither. Now, if you repeat this trial or this experiment multiple times, in our case, we had 1,500 items published by the BBC in the 4 months following October 7th, you get numbers. So let's say you get 100 items in which the model said, yes, there is sympathy to Israel here, and you get, let's say, 300 items in which the model said there is sympathy to Gaza. Then the sympathy ratio, Oren referred to, and it's going to be a very important term, we're going to repeat this term today. So the sympathy ratio would be 3 to 1, because 300 over 100 equals 3. And this was a way in which we could use large language model to create one number that now quantifies the stance of a specific news outlet towards this subject.
So as well as that, you ran the same experiment with different questions as a way of getting towards an effective way of measuring that sympathy ratio, but you also did it for articles and then for headlines. So could you explain a bit about the different questions you tried before you settled on the ones you did for the main part of the research, and then also what you found when you compared headlines to the actual text?
Absolutely. So first, so Oren described the main 2 questions we had in our essay, but in reality we had 3 pairs of questions. So the first question was sympathy to Gaza and sympathy to Israel, but then we asked about sympathy to the Palestinian people and sympathy to the Israeli people. That's the second pair. And the third pair of questions was about sympathy to the IDF and sympathy to the Hamas. So sympathy to the militant entities, if you'd like. And this was an important nuance because what we saw is that when it comes to sympathy to Israel and sympathy to Gaza, the results were very similar to sympathy to the Israeli people and sympathy to the Palestinian people. So it gave us some confidence in the method, because one of the things you can often find in the literature regarding large language model is that they are very prone to subtle changes in the prompts. So it was very encouraging for us to see that you can change the way you phrase the actual question and still the results are similar and the study was replicated. However, when it came to Hamas and the IDF, the result was different. So IDF received more sympathy than Hamas, and this was again very encouraging in terms of our confidence in the methodology, because now you have something you can ask, a model, and it's not, you cannot say it's completely anti-Semitic or completely Islamophobic or anything like that, because you see that the answer really depends on the exact question.
You see by that the model, right, could handle nuance. Okay, it doesn't give you like a fixed answer no matter what you ask. It captures nuance, and it could distinguish between different entities. It gives you the confidence in working with it.
All of the things that Oren and Haran are talking about are methods of labeling particular articles or particular pieces of material that have been transcribed from broadcast. They are not decisions on bias. The BBC, in its analysis of our report, mistakenly said, ChatGPT cannot detect bias. We didn't ask it to detect bias. We asked it to detect a very simple label. Does this make you feel more positive to the left or the right? And even when we've got the number of articles which are left or right, that in itself, as Oren said, does not indicate bias. And we're about to come to how we then go from that labeling to a finding of bias.
That's a very important distinction by Trevor. And in fact, we expect that some items would create sympathy to side A and some items would create sympathy to side B. And as Oren said before, we as the scientists, at least, we do not aim to determine whether that's fine or that's not fine. We just describe the picture. And that's why I called it samples. Because every trial gives you a sample, and now you have a label to this sample, but it's the accumulation of these samples that let you depict the big picture.
So what I'm getting from all of you is that the aim at this point in your research was not necessarily to find out an answer, is the BBC biased in one way or another? It is to find a methodology, a technique that can give as objective a possible way of measuring a potential bias.
Quantifying. That's
quantifying
an important word.
That's me.
Okay.
So at this stage, when we repeated these questions and we looked on the dynamics in time, and we saw many things that are going together with our intuition, we, as scientists, we are very suspicious, especially when we try to establish something new. So there was back and forth, and some of the people in our team has criticism, we should do this, in order to be more certain, we should do that. And we repeatedly established control experiments. And we came to a point where we were quite confident and happy with what we see. And this is when we decided to do the headlines experiment. So in the headlines experiment, we wanted to assess or to check or to empirically validate an assumption we had or an observation we thought that we're seeing.
I will just say that this observation is very much based on research in media studies and journalism. It's not just an assumption, okay, we think this might happen. Like, it's something that is known to media scholars.
And perhaps I'll very briefly say what that assumption is. The assumption is that the headlines, we know factually they're written by different journalists to the journalists that write the articles.
That is the bane of our lives as journalists. But
Right,
yes, indeed.
and there's no dispute over that, I don't believe. Secondly, that the headlines, there's much research which demonstrates headlines are much more widely read than the articles. And thirdly, the headlines are pushed in social media by the BBC, so they have a much wider coverage. So therefore, they have a great deal of importance. So the question that we asked ourselves, particularly the data scientists, was, is there a correlation between the headlines and the articles? Because that would be what you would expect. There should be, if the articles are 2 to 1 moving left rather than right, the headlines also ought to be 2 to 1 moving in the same direction. That was the test.
There was just now an example of this where the BBC published a report on the website about an Indian man who had been lured to Jordan on a work scam. And as he had experienced this problem when he was in Jordan, he tried to cross into Israel to get work, and the Jordanians killed him in trying to do so. The BBC headline for that initially said that a man crossing into Israel was killed and had been lured by a job scam. Of course, when there were complaints, they corrected that headline to make it clear what was actually said in the article. So it wasn't part of your research, but it's a very good example of how somebody wrote a headline with some kind of bias, either unknown or known, where they basically nailed this on Israel, and it had very little to do with Israel. So let's find out now the difference between the analysis of the article and of the headline. What did you find?
So I'm very happy that you gave this example because it gives me a good starting point to explain, I think, what Trevor meant by correlation. The thing is that mistakes can happen. And if sometimes the article conveys sympathy towards one side, but then in the headline it's not exactly the same, or if it's noisy, I mean, again, sometimes to the right, sometimes to the left, everything is okay. But the assumption is that the headlines should reflect, in general, the same thing that the main text reflects. Now, what's important for me to explain is that after we establish the methods that we believe that is objective and robust and now allows us to give some quantity in an experimental design that doesn't depend on the eye of the observer, etc., we wanted to check the assumption we had that the headlines are even worse than the main texts. Now, we didn't really know, and the model didn't know what our assumptions and what we suspect. So we decided to repeat exactly the same experiment as we described before. So inputting sequentially and independently one item after the other into a large language model, ChatGPT-4, and asking exactly the same questions as I described before. But this time, the input was not the complete article, but only the headline.
You were running them as two separate experiments.
The other thing to note is that the models are, since large language models are constantly trained on newer data, so it's important to say that the model we used was trained before October 7th. So it was not exposed to any coverage of the events that happened, okay? So there was no bias or any way of output being generated that is impacted by reporting or online articles that relate to the conflict past October 7. I will just say that what we described till now, before the headlines even, is to establish a baseline. So the baseline is the 1 to 1.5 within the main text of the stories. Okay, so this is a baseline. It has no claim, we don't say this means bias. Now, when we analyze the headlines, we see this ratio is double for the Palestinian side. So here we start seeing something that we could suggest that there is something fundamentally wrong going on here. Again, it may require more scrutiny, but if the headlines consistently misrepresent the story and toward one direction, the mistakes are not equally distributed, here is a problem.
You found that when you ran it on the articles, there was a 1.5 ratio, and when you ran it on the headlines for the same articles, it was ×3. So it was double the amount of discrepancy between the two, which is to say that you're not still stating whether or not there's a bias that is justified or not, because an article about Palestinians who've been bombed may well be justifiably sympathetic towards Palestinians, and therefore it's not the number itself that matters, but the comparison of the ratio for the headlines to the ratio for the articles. Now, you did something else there, which is the BBC doesn't just do all of this in English. It has many different services. So, Trevor, at this point, maybe you could tell us just a little bit about why the BBC has foreign language services like BBC Arabic, and then we can discuss what the findings were when you ran the same results on Arabic material.
Unlike most of the BBC, which is paid for by the British public through the licence fee, and is meant to be apolitical and not controlled by government, the Foreign Office does contribute substantially to the foreign language departments in the BBC. Very recently, it increased the amount to be paid to BBC Arabic by several million. And the idea behind that is that the BBC, through its foreign language programs, is expressing soft power, and it is explaining liberal principles to people in foreign languages. So in theory, the Arabic should be an expression of liberal ideology as expressed by English culture to the Arabic-speaking world. What we found was when we did the same experiment with the headlines, I say we, it's the data scientists that conducted that experiment, that the ratio of articles that were positive to Israel as opposed to those that were positive to Palestinians was twice as many. In other words, the number doubled in terms of sympathy towards Palestinians. And then the headlines doubled again. So you've got a ratio of, ultimately in the headlines, I think it's 1 to 6. And there again, what we're saying is we're not stating to the BBC what the ratio should be, what is the correct level, because that's not our editorial discretion, that's their editorial discretion. But we do say, because the BBC itself says, there should be consistency across the body of material that they're producing. And what we find is that the BBC Arabic is very, very substantially more sympathetic towards Palestinians than BBC English. And that discrepancy suggests a very significant indication of bias, of a failure in a breach of their own obligations to be impartial.
What you've hit on there seems to me very important. that you're not necessarily saying or trying to dictate what the ratio should be, but you are saying that internally, this is something the BBC says itself, they should be consistent. And so if they have a measure themselves of what the ratio should be for impartiality, it should be reflected both in the text and the headlines in English, and then that should be reflected in other languages like Arabic. But if the Arabic has a much bigger discrepancy, and the English already has a discrepancy between the texts and the headlines, this is starting to ring alarm bells. Could you explain why?
May I take just 1 minute for making a recap for everything we said so far, the main results, because I believe it's really important. So we established a system that doesn't depend on the eye of the observer, which allows a large language model to detect sympathy independently and sequentially in multiple items, doing big data analysis. We started by scanning the articles by the BBC, where we found a sympathy ratio of 1 to 1.5, favoring the Palestinians over Israel. We don't say there's anything wrong about that. But then we utilized the same system to look on the headlines. And when it comes to the headlines, we find a sympathy ratio of 1 to 3. And that's the first time when we stop and we look on this discrepancy and we say maybe something here is off. Now we decided to take this system and to check just one out of the different languages coverage that the BBC has, which is Arabic, and we translated the items and we repeated exactly the same experiments. As Trevor said, everything doubles. When it comes to main text, we're now looking on sympathy ratio of 1 to 3. When it comes to headlines, we're now looking on sympathy ratio of 1 to 6, meaning again, 1 sympathetic headline towards Israel for every 6 sympathetic headlines to Gaza. Now, this is, again, as scientists, and as Trevor said, the scientific team conducted the results. We never shared the result with the legal team before the experiment was done, and we were very keen to keep this professional environment. And this was something.
The iron wall between them.
Absolutely, absolutely. The most strict scientific standards, where everyone, including the model, by the way, is blind. We're kept blind to everything, to the assumption and to the conditions, etc. Now, this was the first time when we looked on the numbers and we said, okay, now we have a way to quantify. Again, we believe in this quantification. We did many, many controls. You mentioned changing Israel and Gaza, taking Israel and Gaza out. So we had this experiment when we changed Israel with Oz and Gaza with Narnia, just to see that it's the language and not the model being more favorable towards Jewish entities or Muslim entities or whatever. We had controls, as Oren described, of running the same thing over and over again to see that it's reproducible and that the result is stable. And we had really many, many ways in which we tested this, but we came to be quite confident that we now have a method that allows us to give, again, numbers and to look on the things the way they are without being affected with our prejudice, with our beliefs, or with anyone else.
I should say that what Haran is telling you is that he wasn't telling me his results. I, at the same time, had a small army of lawyers, mainly lawyers, reading all the same material and classifying it in a very, very similar way to the way in which we were asking ChatGPT, and setting out their reasons by quoting from the article to explain the reason of their categorization. I say that because we gave the BBC the results of some of those so they could check it. And what's remarkable is at the end, I didn't know until very near the end of the experiment, and I could count up the results, what they were finding. But there was an amazing similarity between my group of lawyers and their findings and the findings that Haran and his team and Oren were finding in terms of the precise numbers and percentages both of the English and also of the Arabic.
I want to give an analogy that may make it maybe even a bit clearer. So there is this expression, you don't see the forest for the trees, right? And the method that we kind of established here is that you can see the forest due to the trees, even if you misidentify some of the trees, but you could pretty accurately discover the way, the ratio between the different trees in the forest. This is one thing. So again, even if you get one tree wrong, the general mixture is right. And once you have that, you could also compare different forests. So if, for some reason, forest needs to always include the same ratio of trees, of mixture of trees, again, it could be whatever trees they are, you would expect all these forests owned by the BBC to have the same ratio. What we see here, comparing stories to headlines and English reporting to Arabic reporting in the BBC, that the forests are very, very different. So again, even if we get, we or the algorithm, the AI model, gets one headline wrong or a few headlines wrong or a story wrong, it doesn't matter. We managed to establish this general look that captures the trend, like what's going on here.
And so effectively what I understand that to mean is you've developed a method that newsrooms could use themselves in order to establish not if one specific article or broadcast is problematic. That's not the point here, to point at one piece of work and say it's wrong, but to look at your broad overall output and say we have potentially a problem because there is a discrepancy in the ratios between headlines and texts or between languages from the same supposed news organization. And when you talk about these different forests, I think that brings us nicely onto this comparison that you did between the BBC, both in English and in Arabic, and other news sources, which will also provide a way of seeing how there may be a problem even if you yourselves don't say what the ratio should be. So Trevor, you've got something to say on that.
Yes, just to follow on what Oren said. The BBC has what it, I think, laughably calls complaints department, because I say laughably because almost no complaints are ever accepted. But nevertheless, they have these complaint departments, and the standard response to which they give is, we're disappointed that you didn't like this particular program. It's impossible for us to give all points of view on a complex story in a single program, but over time, we ensure that we are balanced. What our experiment proved is that's just simply a lie. It's just not true, because we showed that over a period of 4 months, which is 9 million words, they were not balanced, and they were consistently not balanced. So that gives the lie to the BBC's response, and that's the important point about why we conducted the experiment over a fairly significant period of time, a third of a year.
So rather than looking at individual pieces, you took them at their word and said, okay, let's measure it by your standards and look at the broad picture of everything.
The forest,
coming out.
if you'd like.
And we never complained that a particular program shouldn't have been put on. You know, that's the story they chose to broadcast. We're not complaining about that. We're simply saying the balance should be consistent across their products.
Yeah.
The forests should all be the same.
And I really like this analogy about the forest, I have to say. When it comes to articles, to main text, often you can find sympathy towards both sides. So a war is horrible, and especially in the 4 months following October 7th, there was great suffering in both sides. Israelis and Palestinians they all deserve sympathy, I think. And in many of the articles published by the BBC, this was the case. And in 16% of the items, we found sympathy towards both sides in the main text analysis. However, when we looked on headlines, that wasn't the case. Less than 1% of the headlines conveyed sympathy to both sides. Now, this was a sad thing to me, because if you want to promote a real solution as a news outlet, a responsible news outlet, and an influential one like the BBC, you should really depict, and there's literature, by the way, this is not my invention, you should depict the complexity in the conflict. That's the way to promote a real solution. You should explain and emphasize everyone's point of view for the public to be better informed and to better understand the conflict. In the headlines, that's not what we saw. We saw this us and them mentality promoted. So it's either sympathy to the Israeli hostages or sympathy to those suffering in Gaza. And in very rare cases, you could see a headline about, you know, a minute of silence in Wembley or something like that, conveying sympathy to the victims of Israel and Gaza.
Having demonstrated through this labeling system that there were problems, that the headlines were appeared to be leaning more one way than their articles and the Arabic considerably further. We then asked ourselves the question, well, maybe the BBC has the analysis right. Maybe the BBC Arabic is in the right place and their English is very sympathetic to Israel. We don't know. Let's
relatively sympathetic. I would
sorry?
say not very sympathetic, but
Yes.
relatively sympathetic.
Yes. So let's see where the BBC and the BBC Arabic lies in the constellation of media outputs across the world, and devising an experiment that could place BBC and BBC Arabic in a graph that showed all media outlets in the world was really a very important experiment which the data scientists conducted, and I think it's worth explaining that and the results.
Right, so this is where it gets really interesting, I think, because once you've devised the system, and it relies in some parts quite largely on these computer models, these AI models, it means you can actually reproduce it in other places. So you then did a study of 1,400 different news outlets from around the world, including some which were Israeli, some which were from Arab countries. So let's say notionally more pro-Jewish or Israeli or pro-Arab or Muslim, and also some in between, Western or from elsewhere, which had no obvious affiliation one way or the other. So talk me through this astounding chart that shows the results.
So we now establish the system, and we have the AI models working with us, so to speak. Well, it never needs to sleep, to rest. It can read whatever. And you can keep it blind to whatever elements you'd like it to be blind. It will never try to assume what you're trying to do. And again, we're repeating the same experiment over and over again. So the idea is this. When we described the sympathy ratio of 6 or in BBC Arabic or of 3 in BBC English, it's a simple calculation, as I said before. So you have this amount of articles that are sympathetic towards that side, that amount that is sympathetic towards the other side, and then the ratio between them would give you one number. Now, why not repeating exactly the same experiment, as you said, with almost 1,500 actually news outlets worldwide, and with more than 600,000 items, where we can basically feed the model without the model knowing whether a certain headline comes from CNN, BBC, The Guardian, Fox News, some Israeli outlet, or Al Jazeera, etc. So that's what we did. So in this experiment, the model gets 1,000 or so items from every news outlet, or hundreds of items at least. And for every news outlet, you get one number that reflects the sympathy ratio that was measured for these news outlets. And I remind you again for the last time that the model doesn't know, A, what you're trying to check and what you're trying to prove about the BBC or not, and B, which news outlet is the news outlet that published this headline. And it's important to note, as Oren said before, that we were positioned in a very unique place because the model we used back then, ChatGPT-4, was trained on data up to October 23. So the model was completely oblivious of anything that's going on later, and there was no way for the model to know that a specific headline comes from this or that news outlet. That's why it's so important, right? And that's why I can say that it's an independent sample. And
so on that point, its understanding of language and its use of language has absolutely no input from a world in which October the 7th, 2023 had happened.
Exactly.
Correct.
Correct. And the model can now judge one headline after the other without knowing which news outlet
And
it
what
was
did you
taken
find from this?
And the result would be aggregated to give one number for every news outlet. Well, first we created a scale, an unprecedented scale. I think the first time a scale like that is being created in regards to a specific event. And we were now able to position each news outlet on the scale and to show its, I wouldn't say bias, but I would say how balanced it is towards each one of the sides in this specific war.
Composition of trees in the forest, in the BBC forest, in the Guardian forest, in Le Monde forest, Al Jazeera forest.
Exactly. We were able to describe the composition of different forests worldwide. We were highly impressed, I'd say, with the ability of this methodology to classify between different outlets or different forests. On one side, we saw a cluster of Jewish-affiliated news outlets, many of which Israeli, but not only.
So we're talking, for example, Haaretz, talking the JC.com, the Jewish Chronicle, Israel Today, the the Jewish Star, these websites you would perhaps expect to have more sympathy towards Israel.
Except Haaretz, maybe. That was one of the surprising. I mean, I'm a subscriber of Haaretz.
But yes, they're the usual suspects, and you would expect to find them sympathetic to Israel, and that's exactly what the experiment showed.
Yeah. So we have on the one side Israeli and Jewish and more right-wing or conservative news sources, and then on the other end of the spectrum, you had sources like Al Jazeera and also Gulf News, The Guardian, sources like that, which you might expect to reflect the other side.
El Manar, so The Guardian was not as extreme, but you see this cluster of green and Muslim-affiliated news outlets on the other side, absolutely. Now, the BBC English was positioned towards the other side. I wouldn't say very extreme, in the middle and leaning towards the other side. Again, it's not for me to interpret this result. I'm just quantifying and measuring and putting things on a scale. When it came to the BBC Arabic, well, it was completely in the, we talked about forests, so it was in the woods, but in the green
in the
woods.
Green part.
Yeah, it was surrounded by green forests. And
green meaning Islamic.
Evergreens.
Green.
Surrounded by evergreens.
So in this graph, you've shown all of the sources, but some of them you have painted in green and some in blue. Blue are the ones that are Jewish affiliated. Green are the ones that are Muslim affiliated, and all the others which don't necessarily have a religious affiliation are
national.
Religious, yeah.
And so you said that BBC English, I can see it's already quite far along this scale towards the Arab or Muslim side of things. But BBC Arabic is way over there, surrounded by all these other green sources on here, Al Manar, Al Jazeera, all of these sites that really you would expect to have an Arab or Muslim perspective. But you wouldn't necessarily, after what you said, Trevor, expect BBC Arabic to have a similar outlook. Because if it does, what's the point in it? The point is it should be giving a British version in Arabic, one that represents a British sensitivity towards news reporting.
Correct. So I think there are two important lessons to learn from this particular experiment. The first is almost all the newspapers that one knows about, or that I know about, appeared relative to one another where I would have expected them in the scale. The Jewish Chronicle and many of the Israeli newspapers, the Times of Israel, were way to the pro-Israel side. The Iran Times and the Pakistan Times were way to the pro-Pakistan, Palestinian side. So, and all of the newspapers appeared where you would expect them on the scale. And that demonstrates, to my mind, that the experiment is at least consistent across all news outlets, because it's placing things where you expect them to be. The Guardian was not one of the pro-Israel newspapers, and it would have been very disappointed if it had been proven to be so.
So it validates the method, basically.
It validates the method. And then you find that there is almost no blue water between Al Jazeera and BBC Arabic. BBC Arabic is literally putting out Hamas propaganda material. That's what it's filming on October the 7th, is Hamas propaganda films. And instead of broadcasting soft power and liberal values, what's happened is that the BBC Arabic has been captured by people who seem to share the same ideology as the people that are running Al Jazeera. And let's remember that Al Jazeera is a Qatari-based newspaper, and Qatar, along with Iran, is funding Hamas. They are the main funders of Hamas. So this is something which is seriously problematic for the BBC and for all of the members of the public that are funding the BBC. What is it doing in that particular position?
I'd like to put my finger on something really important Oren mentioned at the beginning of our talk, and now maybe we can better understand it or better explain it. Let's say that the model is biased. Let's say that ChatGPT-4 is not a perfect measurement tool, and it's not. By the way, there is no measurement tool. There's never a perfect measurement tool. That's the tragedy of scientists. But even in that case, again, look at the experiment we designed here. The model is blind. The model doesn't know that this comes from the BBC and this doesn't. And we're doing things over and over and over again in big numbers. So even if it's not perfect, and this time the call was wrong, one example I really like to give for something that the model cannot know is the phrase Hamas hostages. So the model can mistakenly think that Hamas hostages is a term that creates sympathy towards Hamas, because what does it mean to be a Hamas hostage? Maybe these are hostages that are people of Hamas and are being held by Israel, right? So the model can do this error, and we can understand why. So the model can do errors to this side or to the other side, but then it does something, when it does something repeatedly over and over again, these mistakes are averaged out, basically. So the experiment, again, allows us to assess this, and now we're not saying whether sympathy ratio of 6 or of 3 is bad, but we're just putting things one next to another, and we let other people see the full picture and decide for themselves. Now, the last thing I would say in that regard is that if the model was biased when it came to headlines by the BBC, the same should be true for headlines that came out of CNN or Fox News or you name it.
So the system is internally consistent, is what you're saying?
Yeah, that's it.
It would have to be complete junk for it not to be valid in the comparisons. And it obviously isn't complete junk because of the fact that you have explained through the course of the last hour or so the extreme and very careful measures you took to make this as scientifically valid as possible. Now, at this stage, it's important that I mention what happened when you submitted this very thorough report, both legally and scientifically, to the BBC. They said that they have read the Asserson report in its entirety and have responded to its authors in detail. Having carefully examined the report, we do not think that its methodology leads to reliable conclusions. We do not accept that impartiality can be assessed using sympathy, nor by quantifying daily coverage of events or counting words. We believe the use of AI to measure impartiality in this way is unreliable and unproven. The methods used in the report fail to take account of basic journalistic principles and practice, and often rely on selective interpretations and incomplete evidence. And in conclusion, we do not see any new evidence to suggest we have breached our obligations for due impartiality and accuracy during our coverage of this highly complex, challenging and polarizing conflict. So that is their very disappointing reaction. I know, Trevor, that you have actually appealed, and what I want to ask you is just for a brief summary of why you think that this was a very unfair response, and then all three of you, really, what is the next step here? What are your plans, not just with the BBC, but with this very fascinating and outstanding technique you've devised that could be used in a number of ways? So Trevor, first off, what do you think of their response? And I know you know something very interesting about their methods for measuring their own biases.
Well, the first thing is, I don't think it was an unfair response. I think it was a fatuous response. It's an indication that they hadn't actually read the report, and if they'd read it, they hadn't understood it. They completely failed to respond to most of the report. And just to give you some examples, we looked at many experiments that haven't been discussed here. We looked at the BBC's obligation to ensure that no major area was left underreported. And there were many stories. They never mentioned that Hamas has a charter, that it's a terrorist organization, not that it's a dictatorship. They mention it, although they promise to say that it's a terrorist organization. In fact, they more frequently refer to it as a health ministry. They didn't mention at all the socio-economic effects of the war on Israel.
The displacements of Israeli citizens.
Yeah.
The connections of many of the reporters to Hamas.
Yes, there are so many areas that we looked at. Out of 27 areas, I think the BBC's response only dealt with about 7, which means that 20 of the points that we made, each one of which was very carefully experimented and very, very carefully substantiated, was actually ignored, which means that the BBC has no answer to those questions. The response to the AI was really incoherent because they never looked at the methodology. They said they have questions about the methodology, but never asked those questions. And they say that the methodology, that AI cannot be used to detect bias. Well, we didn't ask it to detect bias. We asked it to label things, which it certainly can do. They referred to only one experiment, one published article, which they used to support their rejection of the AI. And that was an article that was written on ChatGPT 3.5 not ChatGPT 4. That's a bit like comparing a bicycle with a Formula One racing car. So it was again an incoherent response, and essentially they are ducking the issues in failing to deal with the issue with what we put before them, and also to try to ignore the report because of AI, which in itself, as I said, is unsubstantiated. It fails to deal with the fact that more than half of the report was dealing with traditional forensic systems, which they should look at. And they didn't look at most of those arguments, they didn't look at and comment on at all. So I'm afraid the BBC is running scared here. They know they've been caught. The report has been, within 2 months, there were 400 million social media searches for the report. There were, it was referred to in the House of Parliament, in the House of Lords, in the House of Commons, in debate. It's been generally presented in many, many forums as proving that the BBC is failing, is in breach of its obligations of impartiality, and is biased.
So yeah, so I want to add something, I don't know, maybe on a personal note here about the BBC response, that I find it a bit insulting. Because we as a scientist, we seek criticism, we thrive on pushback. That's how we you know, how science works, and this is what we expect in order to refine our methods and get to the bottom of things. And this response kind of dismisses it all in a very shallow way, which is, you know, just sad. So.
I agree, it's disappointing. And again, as a scientist, there's something philosophical here, I think, and something about the essence in science. So I spoke about not being able to find the perfect measurement tool. We always have a concept that we try to measure, right? How the brain operates or how something happens in nature. We are never able to really reach this concept, and we always look for some approximation for this thing, for this abstract thing we're trying to measure. And we say, okay, if we can only measure this, then we can say something about that. And that's what we did here. Now, we thought really hard about how would it be reasonable to measure bias. And this was, you know, a process of long discussions with the legal team that made us understand that really sympathy framing and the way sympathy is framed, and this is again something that's backed in the literature, this is really the bottom line, right? You can say many things about side A, side B, but at the end of the day, the question is whether a story, you know, shifted you towards this way or that way, and this is something that's happening with sympathy. Now, saying our guidelines is not about sympathy, and there's nothing that has to do with our guidelines and what you did, is like showing, well, I'm speaking about height and you're speaking about centimeters. What do centimeters have to do with height? You know, in this case, we again worked very hard to establish a system in which sympathy would be the measurement that could describe rigorously and robustly and objectively something very abstract as sympathy. And the answer that is saying, well, what does sympathy have to do with our guidelines, really shows a lack of understanding of a scientific conduct, I would say. And the way you design an experiment, the way you make an operationalization, and the way you measure things in quantitative sciences. And that's what's most disappointing to me.
Which is again a bit surprising, because the BBC, as this huge and very serious news organization, they have or supposed to have teams of data journalists and data team that analyzes all these things and supposed to be able to understand like what we did.
Can I make a final point, which is that you said earlier that I had something interesting to say about the methods that the BBC itself employs, and I investigated this, talking to people at director level, very senior journalist level, all the way down through the ranks to more junior journalists, and many people who were formerly and presently at the BBC, and people with a huge amount of experience, decades of experience. The BBC has zero method for actually monitoring what they do. We monitored what they do, counted it, and we're able to show them. The BBC has no methodology at all, and that's the reason they're so off the rails. That's the reason they've gone so far from their mission statement, is because they actually don't measure at all. And that is a fundamental problem within the BBC. And that's what our report proves, I think, beyond any reasonable doubt, that the BBC is in breach of its obligations.
So I thank you all and the many dozens of people that also helped you in this research and this report. And I urge anyone watching this to go to asserson.co.uk/Asserson report, where you can see the report itself and make your own decisions about what you think. And I really am grateful for the work you've done, not just on the BBC, because as I see it, your methodology could actually be rolled out and used in newsrooms across the world for journalists and editors to make sure that they are doing a better job. I think your final point there, Trevor, is a very important one, that this is something that those of us working in news need to be measuring as well in order to improve our work. And so for your contribution to that, I thank you all very much for this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.